In general, there's a number of common math mistakes in terms of the actual doing of the math that can lead to, avoidable mistakes, silly mistakes. I just want to list some of them out here. First, arithmetic errors, of course. We've all done it, but just be careful, especially in the heat of the moment, when you're under pressure, under time pressure, stress, that you don't do 9 plus 4 is 11 or anything like that, right? Those little mistakes will cost you, because the thing about this test is there's no partial credit. And, most of the math tests you do in school, probably, you're going to get partial credit. Even if you make a little mistake, you might get the majority of the points. But that's not the way it is on this test. And so we kind of have to undo that training that we might have gotten in math class and make sure that we're being careful. Dropping negatives, very common, right? Messing up the sign, either making something negative or forgetting the negative, or just kind of anything to do with positives and negatives. Just a lot of places mistakes crop up there. Same thing with distribution. So when you're distributing a number, let's say, this is very common, it's related to dropping negatives. Let's say we have x plus, or let's do x minus 2x minus 3. And so let's say we're going to, I'm going to make this actually 4x. So let's say we're going to distribute that negative, and let's actually make it a negative, let's make it a minus 5, how about? So 4x minus 5 times 2x minus 3. So most of the time, test takers will do this correctly. They'll distribute the negative 5 to the 2x, and they'll get minus 10x. But don't forget, you got to take that negative 5 and multiply it by negative 3. Don't just write minus 15. It's got to be plus 15. So little mistakes like that, I've just seen them so much. So just be aware that you're entering into the danger zone whenever you're dealing with anything involving distributing. Just be careful. Same thing with substitution. This is why generally I recommend, when you're doing problems involving systems of equations, for example, that elimination is typically safer. In other problems, though, you'll have to do substitution, so just be very careful making substitutions. It's easy to, mess up the distribution, mess up a negative, just make mistakes like that. So that's a time to be aware. Rounding errors are also places where mistakes come in. In the grid-ins, they will tell you in a problem if you're going to have to round. And so they might say round to the nearest integer, round to the nearest tenth. Just make sure you're rounding to the nearest whatever and that you're rounding appropriately. This is a big topic, which, we could have a whole series of videos on, but just generally speaking, watch out for what we can call over-aggressive cancellation. So involving algebra, just be careful that you're not canceling things that can't be canceled, or, a common one, for example, would be something like, 4x plus 8 divided by 4x, let's say. Students might want to cancel those out and say, oh, this is 1 plus 8 or something. But that sort of cancellation you can't do. So just be very careful when you're simplifying that you're not too aggressive in what you're canceling. And then fraction errors. So fractions, I tend to find students struggle with quite a bit for a number of reasons. So anytime you're dealing with fractions, just beware. One thing I like to do is try to get rid of the fractions if possible. So if you can multiply by a number or just somehow get rid of the fractions, it's usually a good way to avoid mistakes. So in any of these cases, when you're doing a problem involving negatives or distributing or substitution or rounding or factoring and canceling, anything to do with fractions, bring yourself into a heightened state of awareness and say, okay, I'm doing my work here, but in the back of my mind, I have to remember, let me make sure, let me double check my work. Let me revise that in my head, right? When I see all my work on paper, let me make sure I got my negative in the right place. I got my, fractions been handled properly, especially in the grid-ins where there aren't choices, but even in the multiple choice, because a lot of times they're going to set up choices that are traps because they can anticipate the kinds of mistakes that a student might make on that question. So when you enter the danger zone, just rework your work, right? Do your work and then just take 5 to 10 seconds, just recheck what you did, just make sure there's no mistakes, and then go with your answer.